What if the Emperor of Mankind, the immortal god-tyrant who carved humanity's destiny across the stars, wasn't the first to try? What if, hidden beneath 10,000 years of propaganda and genetic manipulation, there existed two failed prototypes, two abandoned children who witnessed their father's glory from the shadows, forever denied the light they helped create? In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, where even the custodians dare not venture without express command, there exists a chamber. No records speak of it. No servitor has ever cleaned its halls. Within this place, sealed behind doors that have not opened since the Unification Wars, stand two figures carved from gene-wrought flesh and bitter memory. They are not statues, though they stand motionless. They are not dead, though they have not drawn breath in millennia. They are the first and the second, the prototype Primarchs that history forgot. The men of stone and the men of gold, humanity's original saviors, abandoned when they failed to meet their creator's impossible standards. The story begins not in the Gothic darkness of the 41st millennium, but in an age when Terra still remembered hope. Before the Emperor revealed himself to the warring techno-barbarians, before the Thunder Warriors carved the path to unity through blood and fire. In that forgotten era, he worked in solitude within a laboratory carved from the bedrock of what was once the Himalayan mountains. The master of mankind, already ancient beyond measure, stood before his greatest challenge, the creation of posthuman generals to lead humanity back from the brink of extinction. The galaxy was a howling wound. The age of strife had torn reality itself, leaving human worlds isolated, regressing, dying alone in the dark. The Emperor knew that conventional warriors, even enhanced ones, would never be enough. He needed demigods, beings who could inspire entire star systems through their mere existence. Generals who could wage war across 1,000 fronts simultaneously. Sons who could shoulder the burden of an entire species' salvation. But creating a god is not like forging a sword. The first attempts were grotesque failures, flesh that grew cancerous and wild, minds that shattered under the weight of their own enhanced cognition, abominations that had to be incinerated before they could draw their first screaming breaths. The laboratory floor ran red with the remains of potential saviors, each failure teaching the Emperor what not to do, narrowing the infinite possibilities into a path that might succeed. Then came the breakthrough. The Emperor succeeded in stabilizing the genetic template, creating beings that could house the psychic potential and physical perfection he required. But these first stable Primarchs were not the 20 sons who would later conquer the galaxy. These were something else entirely. He called them the Men of Stone, after the legendary artificial intelligences that had once guided humanity during the dark age of technology. They were beings of absolute logic, perfect calculation, warriors who could process battlefield data with the cold precision of a thinking machine. They felt no fear, no doubt, no hesitation. They were flawless instruments of war. The Emperor tested them in the field during the early Unification Wars. The Men of Stone were devastating. They conquered techno-barbarian kingdoms with strategies so ruthlessly efficient that entire armies would surrender rather than face annihilation. They calculated supply lines, predicted enemy movements, optimized troop deployments with inhuman accuracy. Victory followed victory, each one more complete than the last. But the Emperor watched his stone sons with growing unease. He saw how the survivors of conquered territories looked at these perfect warriors with fear, yes, but also with a hollow emptiness. The Men of Stone inspired no loyalty beyond terror. They could not understand why a soldier might sacrifice himself for a brother in arms. They saw courage as inefficient risk-taking. Honor was an irrational impediment to optimal outcomes. They won every battle but conquered no hearts. One night, after a particularly brutal campaign where the Men of Stone had efficiently massacred a civilian population, calculated to be harboring resistance fighters, the Emperor made his decision. Perfection without humanity was not perfection at all. It was simply tyranny dressed in genetic superiority. The men of stone were quietly removed from the front lines. Officially, they never existed. The Thunder Warriors took credit for their victories. And in his laboratory, the Emperor began again. The men of gold were his answer, an overcorrection, perhaps, or maybe an attempt to balance the equation. Where the men of stone were cold logic, the men of gold would be burning passion. Where stone could not inspire, gold would shine with such charisma that ordinary humans would weep at the sight of them. The Emperor poured into these new creations every noble quality he had observed in humanity's greatest heroes throughout history: compassion, courage, the ability to inspire not through fear, but through love. When the first man of gold drew breath, he laughed with joy at the simple fact of existence. When he first led troops into battle, soldiers followed him not because they were ordered, but because they could not imagine doing anything else. He was everything the stone warriors were not: warm, empathetic, able to see the value in a single human life even while waging war on a planetary scale. For a time, the Emperor believed he had finally succeeded. The men of gold won victories as impressive as their stone predecessors, but they did so while inspiring such devotion that conquered populations begged to join the nascent Imperium. They were everything a Primarch should be. Until they were not. The flaw revealed itself slowly, like a crack spreading through golden armor. The men of gold cared too much. They felt too deeply. They could not make the hard choices that empire building demanded. When faced with a decision that would save 1,000,000 lives at the cost of 1,000, they hesitated. When required to destroy a city to prevent a greater catastrophe, they sought alternatives until it was too late. Their empathy, their humanity, the very qualities that made them beloved, became shackles that prevented them from doing what was necessary. The Emperor watched his golden sons agonize over decisions he could make in an instant. He saw them weep over casualties that were strategically acceptable. He realized with cold certainty that he had failed again. The men of gold were too human to be Primarchs. They would be crushed under the weight of the impossible choices that conquering a galaxy required. And so, one final time, the Emperor returned to his laboratory. This time, he would create his synthesis. 20 Primarchs who balanced logic and emotion. Warriors who could be ruthless when necessary, but inspire when required. Each one specialized, each one crafted to lead a specific aspect of his great crusade. The men of stone taught him that perfection without humanity was monstrous. The men of gold taught him that humanity without ruthlessness was weakness. But what happened to the prototypes? Where did the Emperor's first sons go when they were deemed insufficient? The official records are silent. The histories speak only of the 20 Primarchs scattered by chaos, found and raised across the galaxy. But in the deepest vaults, behind doors sealed with the Emperor's own psychic wards, perhaps something waits. Perhaps the men of stone still stand in their cold perfection, aware of everything, feeling nothing, eternally calculating the efficiency of their own abandonment. Perhaps the men of gold still shine in their golden prison, weeping for a father who loved them enough to create them, but not enough to let them be imperfect. And perhaps in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where even the Emperor's perfect Primarchs have failed, fallen, or vanished, someone will remember that beneath the palace, humanity's first saviors wait, silent, forgotten, but not gone. Never truly gone. The truth about the men of stone and the men of gold would have remained buried forever, lost to the same historical revisionism that erased the Thunder Warriors and redacted the lost Primarchs from Imperial record, if not for a single moment of desperation during the Siege of Terra. When Horus stood at the gates of the Imperial Palace, when the War Master's forces threatened to tear apart everything the Emperor had built, the Master of Mankind made calculations that would have horrified even his most pragmatic sons. In the bowels of the palace, surrounded by the dying screams of 1 billion defenders, he walked corridors he had not entered in 10,000 years. The Emperor remembered their faces with perfect clarity. He had designed them, after all, sculpted every feature with purpose and intent. The men of stone had possessed a stark beauty, angular, precise, faces that looked as though they had been carved by a master sculptor working in marble. No asymmetry, no flaw. Even their expressions had been perfectly controlled, revealing nothing, calculating everything. The men of gold had been different, warm features that shifted with genuine emotion, eyes that crinkled with laughter, faces that could show sorrow so profound it made hardened warriors weep in sympathy. He had thought about them often over the centuries, his first sons, though he would never have admitted such sentiment to anyone. During the Great Crusade's brightest days, when Horus stood at his side and Sanguinius soared overhead, the Emperor would sometimes wonder if the prototypes watched from their sealed chambers. Could the men of stone calculate the probability of the Imperium's success? Did the men of gold feel pride at seeing their refined successors conquer the galaxy? He had never checked. The chambers were sealed not just with locks, but with intention, with the psychic equivalent of turning one's back on a mistake too painful to acknowledge. But now, with chaos literally at his door and half his Primarchs turned traitor, the Emperor's desperation overrode his shame. If the men of stone could calculate victory from impossible odds, he needed their cold logic. If the men of gold could inspire the defenders to hold just one more hour, their sacrifice would not have been in vain. His hand, the same hand that had forged the Primarchs and shattered gods, trembled as it reached for the vault's seal. The door opened soundlessly despite millennia of disuse. The chamber beyond was exactly as he had left it, a vast circular hall lit by dim lumens that flickered with uncertain power. And there, standing in alcoves around the perimeter like forgotten statues in an abandoned temple, were his first children. 12 men of stone on the left, their eyes closed, their breathing so shallow it was nearly undetectable. 10 men of gold on the right, frozen in various poses of anguish as though they had been stopped mid-movement, mid-scream, mid-plea. The Emperor had not killed them. He had never possessed the ruthlessness to destroy his own creations, even failed ones. Instead, he had placed them in suspended animation, their enhanced metabolism slowed to near stasis, their minds locked in dreamless sleep. They were not dead, but they were not truly alive either, existing in a twilight state between, waiting for a purpose that would never come. It was, in its own way, crueler than execution. He approached the nearest man of stone, designated Primus Alpha 1, the very first stable Primarch ever created. Even in stasis, the being radiated an aura of mathematical perfection. The Emperor placed his hand on the stasis field, feeling the hum of ancient technology he himself had designed. All he had to do was deactivate it. All he had to do was wake this warrior and explain that the Imperium needed him. That humanity's survival demanded the cold calculations only a man of stone could provide. But as his psychic senses touched the sleeping mind within, the Emperor recoiled. The man of stone was not dreaming, his kind did not dream, but his consciousness had not been idle during these 10 millennia. Instead, it had done what it was designed to do, calculate. For 10,000 years, Primus Alpha 1 had been running simulations, analyzing every scrap of data his final memories provided, projecting the probable trajectory of the Imperium based on the Emperor's decision to abandon the stone prototypes in favor of the 20 Primarchs. The conclusions were devastating in their clarity. The man of stone had calculated, with 97% probability, that the Emperor's Primarchs would fail. That beings created with emotion and individuality would inevitably develop the ego to challenge their creator. That Horus would fall, perhaps not the exact circumstances, but the probability had always been there, written in the genetic code that valued glory over pure logic. The man of stone had known, had calculated it all while sleeping in his prison, and had been powerless to warn anyone. The Emperor withdrew his hand as though burned. He moved to the men of gold instead, hoping to find something less damning, some comfort in the passionate nobility he had crafted into their souls. He approached Arius Prime 1, the first of the golden prototypes, whose face even in stasis showed traces of a smile, as though he had gone to sleep thinking of something beautiful. This time, when the Emperor's consciousness touched the sleeping mind, he found not calculations but dreams. The men of gold had spent their imprisonment dreaming, and their dreams were windows into what might have been. Aureus had dreamed of leading the Great Crusade, but his version was different, slower, gentler, taking time to understand each culture before integration, building genuine alliances rather than conquering through intimidation and force. In his dreams, the crusade took not 2 centuries but 5, yet the Imperium that emerged was stable, beloved, worth defending not out of fear or duty, but genuine loyalty. In Aureus's dreams, there was no Horus heresy because there was no need for one. The Primarchs were not scattered across the galaxy by chaos, but raised together on Terra, learning from each other, tempering each other's extremes. They became true brothers rather than rivals. And humanity, instead of being united through fear of the Emperor's wrath, chose unity because they saw in the men of gold proof that posthuman beings could be trusted, could be loved, could be part of the human story rather than its replacement. The Emperor stood between his 2 failures, the logical and the emotional, and understood with crushing clarity why he had sealed them away. It was not because they had failed to meet his standards. It was because they had shown him 2 paths he was not brave enough to take. The men of stone would have built an Imperium that ran with mechanical efficiency, but lacked any soul worth saving. The men of gold would have built an Imperium worth saving, but would have moved too slowly to save it from the threats that circled humanity like sharks scenting blood. So he had tried to split the difference with the 20 Primarchs, giving each one a specialized nature: Guilliman's logic, Sanguinius's nobility, Russ's savagery, Logar's faith. He had thought that by creating a diversity of approaches, the Primarchs would balance each other, that their brotherhood would prevent the extremes that doomed the prototypes. But he had been wrong. The diversity became division. The specialization became limitation. Each Primarch was perfect for his role, but incomplete as an individual, and that incompleteness had made them vulnerable to chaos's whispers. A sound echoed through the chamber, distant explosions from the siege above. The palace was shaking under the bombardment of traitor titans. The Emperor had perhaps minutes before he would be needed on the walls, before his presence would be required to face Horus in their final confrontation. He looked at his first sons, these forgotten prototypes, and made a decision that would haunt him for all eternity. He would not wake them, not because they could not help, but because they deserved better than to be called upon only in desperation, only when the real Primarchs had failed. The men of stone and men of gold had been abandoned once. To wake them now would be to abandon them again, to confirm that they were nothing more than tools to be used when convenient and discarded when not needed. If the Emperor could not love them enough to free them during times of peace, he would not insult them by begging for their help during war. Instead, he placed his hands on the central control mechanism and began modifying the stasis fields. He poured a fraction of his vast psychic power into the system, reinforcing it, ensuring it would survive even if the palace fell, even if Terra burned. He encoded a message into the very structure of the fields, a message that would only be readable by someone with both the psychic sensitivity and technical knowledge to understand it. Message that might take 10,000 years to be found, or might never be found at all. The message was simple: you were not failures. I was, and beneath that admission, buried in layers of encryption that would take a genius to decode, were the complete schematics of the men of stone and men of gold. Not as a warning, not as a template to be repeated, but as a record. Proof that before the Emperor had created his 20 sons, before the Great Crusade and the heresy and the Long War, he had tried a different path. 2 different paths. And both had taught him that there was no perfect solution to the problem of creating posthuman leaders. Every path led to tragedy, just different flavors of it. The Emperor sealed the chamber once more and walked back toward the war that would cost him everything. He did not know that in 10,000 years, the chamber would remain sealed, that the men of stone and men of gold would continue their strange half-life, waiting in the dark. He did not know that his message would remain unread, that his first sons would be forgotten, even by those who remembered the lost 2nd and 11th legions. He knew only that some mistakes were too precious to destroy and too painful to correct. Above, the battle raged. Below, in the silence of abandoned dreams, humanity's first saviors waited. And in their endless sleep, perhaps they understood what their father never could, that there was wisdom in failure, that the prototypes often see truths the final product cannot, and that being forgotten is sometimes kinder than being remembered for all the wrong reasons. Millennia passed in the darkness of the sealed chamber like seconds to beings who experience time in slow motion, their consciousness operating at a fraction of normal speed to preserve sanity during the endless waiting. But for the men of stone, sanity was not something that required preservation. It was a mathematical constant, unchanging and absolute. Primus Alpha 1 continued his calculations, building models upon models, running endless simulations of an Imperium he would never see. His brothers in stone did likewise, each one processing different variables, their minds unconsciously networked through some quirk of their genetic design that the Emperor had never quite understood. By the end of the first millennium, the men of stone had calculated the fall of the Imperium with 89% probability. By the 5th millennium, they had refined the prediction to 94%, accounting for the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne, the rise of the ecclesiarchy, the slow corruption of the administratum. By the 9th millennium, they were certain, not just probable, but certain that the Imperium as the Emperor had envisioned it was already dead, shambling forward on momentum and faith, a corpse that had not yet realized it should fall. But the men of stone, in their perfect logic, discovered something their creator had never anticipated. They began to feel, not emotions in the human sense, but something analogous, a recognition pattern that registered as dissatisfaction with their own existence. They had been designed to solve problems, yet the greatest problem, their own abandonment, had no logical solution. They could calculate 1,000 ways the Emperor could have utilized them, but none of those calculations changed the reality that he had chosen not to. The logic loop created a strange resonance in their artificial neural pathways, something that a human might call sadness, but that registered in their consciousness as persistent systemic error. Primus Alpha 1, who had never questioned an order in his brief period of operation, found himself questioning everything. If logic was supreme, why had the Emperor chosen emotion? If efficiency guaranteed victory, why had he abandoned efficiency for unpredictability? The man of stone ran the calculations again and again, searching for the error in his reasoning, but the math was flawless. The only logical conclusion was that the Emperor had made an illogical choice. And if the Emperor, the greatest being in the galaxy, chose illogic over logic, then perhaps logic itself was insufficient. This realization propagated through the network of stone minds like a virus, infecting each one with the same paradox. They were beings of pure reason encountering a problem that reason could not solve. Some human part of them, buried deep in the genetic code they shared with the later Primarchs, began to wake. They started to dream, not like humans, but in cascades of hypothetical scenarios. What if calculations that had no practical purpose? They imagined what they might have become if the Emperor had given them another chance. They constructed elaborate fantasies of redemption, each one methodically dismantled by their logical cores as statistically improbable, yet each one rebuilt by some deeper need that had no name in their vocabulary. The men of gold experienced time differently. Where the stone warriors calculated, the gold dreamed in endless variations of the same theme: love and loss, creation and abandonment, the fundamental loneliness of being made for a purpose and denied the chance to fulfill it. Aureus Prime One's dreams had started beautiful, filled with visions of the Imperium he would have built, but over millennia they curdled into something darker. In his 10,000-year sleep, Aureus dreamed that he woke. In the dream, he broke free from his stasis field and wandered the palace, searching for his father. But the palace was empty, endless corridors stretching into infinity, each one lined with statues of the 20 Primarchs, his younger brothers, the successful sons. He called out for them, his voice echoing through marble halls, but none answered. He found their pedestals, read their inscriptions, learned their names and deeds. Horus the War Master, Guilliman the Realm Builder, Sanguinius the Angel. And as he read, something toxic bloomed in Arius's golden heart: jealousy. The men of gold had been designed with the capacity for the full spectrum of human emotion, and jealousy was part of that spectrum. He was the first, yet they were remembered. He had loved the Emperor perfectly, yet these flawed copies had earned the Father's love in return. In his dream, Arius began to hate his brothers, began to fantasize about proving his worth by destroying theirs. He imagined himself leading armies against Ultramar, tearing down Guilliman's perfect society to show that order built on emotion was superior to order built on logic. He dreamed of ripping Sanguinius's wings from his back, proving that true nobility required no angelic appearance to inspire devotion. But these dark dreams horrified him, because unlike the traitor Primarchs who had embraced their corruption, Arius could not escape the fact that his hatred was born from love. He did not want to destroy his brothers, he wanted to be his brothers, to have their opportunities, their father's attention, their place in history. And that desire, that desperate need for validation, was more painful than any physical torture the Emperor could have devised. The other men of gold dreamed similar dreams, each one descending into their own private hell of unrequited love and unrecognized sacrifice. They felt every emotion the Emperor had given them with an intensity magnified by millennia of deprivation. Hope turned to despair. Love turned to resentment. Joy became a memory so distant it felt like a lie. They were drowning in their own humanity, and there was no one to save them because the very concept of their existence had been erased from history. In the 41st millennium, as the Imperium teetered on the brink of annihilation, something changed in the chamber. A presence touched the outer seal, not trying to open it, but examining it with psychic senses so refined they could only belong to one of the Emperor's own creations. The consciousness was familiar yet alien, powerful yet restrained, and it carried with it the unmistakable psychic signature of Primarch genetic code. It was Reboot Guilliman, newly resurrected by the Inari, still adjusting to a galaxy that had become a nightmare of bureaucratic decay and religious fanaticism. The Lord of Ultramar had been exploring the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, searching for any artifacts or knowledge that might help him save what remained of his father's dream. His psychic senses, never his strongest attribute but enhanced by his recent resurrection, brushed against the sealed chamber and recoiled in shock. There were Primarchs inside, multiple Primarchs. The genetic signature was unmistakable, yet it was wrong somehow older, rawer, like the difference between a master painting and the artist's preliminary sketches. Guilliman's ordered mind raced through possibilities, the lost second and 11th, but the psychic resonance suggested more than two beings. Clones? Chaos corruption? Some Xenos trick? He did not open the door. Guilliman, for all his desire to restore his father's Imperium, had learned caution in this new age. He had seen what desperation had driven the Imperium to create, the abominations of the cursed founding, the madness of the Death Corps, the horror of the Archoflagellants. If his father had sealed something behind wards this powerful, there was reason. Yet the temptation gnawed at him. What if these beings could help? What if they held knowledge lost to time? Inside the chamber, the Men of Stone detected Guilliman's presence through sensors that still functioned after 10 millennia. They calculated the probability that this was their chance for freedom, 73% likelihood that the newcomer could open the seals. They ran scenarios for what they would do if freed. Most ended in violence, not because they desired it, but because their calculations showed that their very existence would destabilize the Imperium's carefully constructed mythology. They were inconvenient truths, and the Imperium had always dealt with such truths through extermination. The Men of Gold felt Guilliman's presence differently, as a connection to the world they had been denied. A brother they had never met yet were designed to love. Aureus Prime 1, through the haze of his eternal dream, reached out with his own psychic potential, undeveloped but present. He did not try to communicate words, only emotion, a desperate, wordless plea for acknowledgement, for some confirmation that they existed, that they mattered, that their suffering had not been completely meaningless. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, Guilliman felt it. A wave of such profound loneliness and love mixed together that it nearly drove the Lord of Ultramar to his knees. The emotion was pure, uncorrupted by chaos, yet so intense it bordered on madness. And beneath it, he sensed something that made his blood run cold. These beings, whatever they were, had been awake. Not physically, but mentally. They had been conscious during their entire imprisonment, experiencing every moment of their abandonment in excruciating detail. Guilliman stepped back from the seal, his hand trembling. He understood in that instant why his father had never spoken of this place. Some prisons were not meant to protect the outside world from what was within. Some prisons were meant to protect the imprisoned from a world that would destroy them simply for existing. To open this chamber would be to expose these beings, these brothers, to an Imperium that would see them only as heresy, as genetic deviations from the sacred template of the Primarchs, as abominations to be purged. Yet to leave them sealed was to become complicit in their torture. Guilliman, who had built 500 worlds through logic and order, found himself facing a problem that had no logical solution. Save them and doom them. Leave them and damn himself. For the first time since his resurrection, the Primarch of the Ultramarines understood the weight his father had carried. The knowledge that every choice led to suffering, that there was no path forward that did not require someone to be sacrificed. He made his decision. Guilliman turned from the chamber and walked away, but not before placing his hand on the seal one final time. Through the psychic connection, he sent a single thought, knowing it might be received or might vanish into the void. The thought was simple, inadequate, but all he could offer: you are not forgotten. Not by me, not anymore. Inside the chamber, 22 beings who had been designed to save humanity felt the acknowledgement wash over them like rain after an eternity of drought. It changed nothing about their situation. The seals remained intact. The darkness remained absolute. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the men of stone and the men of gold knew that someone beyond their tomb knew they existed. And in that knowledge, something shifted in their long stasis, a new variable entering calculations that had run unchanged for millennia, a new emotion coloring dreams that had grown stale with repetition. Hope, terrible, irrational, beautiful hope. Hope, once introduced to minds that had existed without it for 10 millennia, became a contagion more virulent than any plague. The men of stone, whose consciousness had remained rigid and controlled despite the paradoxes that had begun to fracture their certainty, found their calculations disrupted by a variable they had never properly accounted for: the possibility of change. Primus Alpha 1 diverted processing power from his endless simulations of imperial collapse to model new scenarios, probabilities that had seemed irrelevant mere moments before. If one Primarch knew they existed, others might learn. If Guilliman had chosen not to destroy them, perhaps their existence was not the existential threat they had calculated it to be. But the stone warriors were creatures of logic, and logic demanded they examine this hope with the same ruthless analysis they applied to everything else. They calculated the probability that Guilliman would return, 12%. The probability that he would open the seals, 3%. The probability that they would be freed rather than destroyed if their existence became widely known, less than 1%. The numbers were devastating, yet the men of stone discovered something that would have fascinated their creator. They chose to hope anyway. It was their first truly irrational act, and it felt like a form of freedom they had never experienced during their brief time of operation. For the men of gold, hope was a double-edged sword that cut deeper than any blade. Aureus Prime 1's dreams, which had grown so dark they resembled the nightmares of chaos itself, suddenly shifted tone. He dreamed that Guilliman returned, that the seal opened, that light flooded the chamber for the first time in 10,000 years. In his dream, he stepped forward to meet his younger brother, prepared to embrace him, to finally join the brotherhood he had been designed for but never permitted to experience. But when Guilliman saw him, truly saw him, the Lord of Ultramar's expression was not one of joy or welcome. It was pity. And Arius understood that pity was worse than hatred, worse than fear, worse even than being forgotten. To be pitied was to be diminished, to be seen as a victim rather than a warrior, a tragedy rather than a hero. The dream shifted, became a premonition or a warning, or perhaps just the paranoia of a mind too long denied reality. Arius saw himself freed, but shackled in different ways, paraded before the High Lords as a curiosity, studied by tech priests searching for genetic deviations, preached about by ecclesiarchy priests as evidence of the Emperor's divine trial and error. He saw himself becoming a symbol of failure, a cautionary tale told to neophytes about the importance of accepting the Emperor's final design. In this vision, freedom was just another form of imprisonment, and hope revealed itself as the cruelest torture of all. Yet even knowing this, even understanding that hope might be a poison more destructive than despair, Arius could not let it go. The men of gold had been designed to feel, and millennia of enforced numbness had left them starving for any sensation, even painful ones. Hope hurt, but it was proof they were still capable of feeling anything at all. They clung to it the way a drowning man clings to debris, knowing it might not save them, but unable to relinquish the possibility. The chamber itself seemed to respond to the change in its occupants. Ancient systems that had run on automatic for millennia began to fluctuate. Power readings spiked and dipped. The stasis fields, calibrated to contain beings in a state of dreamless suspension, struggled to compensate for minds that were now actively fighting against their constraints. The Men of Stone's networked consciousness created feedback loops that the machinery had never been designed to handle. The Men of Gold's emotional states generated psychic resonances that rippled through the warp-shielded walls like tremors before an earthquake. In the palace above, in chambers where the custodians maintained their eternal vigil, warning klaxons began to sound. Deep vault anomalies were being detected, power fluctuations in sections that should have been completely dormant. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, Constantin Valder's distant successor, studied the data with growing concern. The readings were coming from a section of the palace that existed on no official map, a void in the schematics that the custodians had always assumed was simply a seismic buffer or geological irregularity. 3 custodians were dispatched to investigate, each one a warrior who had never known defeat, whose genetic enhancement rivaled that of the Primarchs themselves. They descended through layers of the palace that grew progressively older, architecture shifting from the Gothic grandeur of the modern Imperium to the brutal functionality of the Unification Wars era, and finally to something even more ancient, chambers carved during the Age of Strife, when the Emperor had worked in secrecy on projects that predated even the Thunder Warriors. They found the sealed door, and the moment they laid eyes on it, they knew they had discovered something that should have remained lost. The seals bore the Emperor's personal mark, psychic wards woven with a complexity that suggested he had not wanted this door opened under any circumstances. The custodians were genetically programmed to obey the Emperor's will above all else. Yet here they faced a paradox. Was it the Emperor's will that they investigate the anomaly, or was it his will that they respect the seal he had placed? The leader of the custodian squad, a warrior named Heraclast who had served for over 3 centuries, made the decision to report back rather than proceed. But as he turned to leave, he felt it, the same psychic emanation that had touched Guilliman. Not words, not even coherent thoughts, but raw emotion bleeding through 10 millennia of containment. Loneliness, desperation, and beneath it all, something that made Heraclast's enhanced heart skip a beat, the psychic signature of Primarch genetic material. Not one Primarch, many. The custodians were not like the Adeptus Astartes, bred for war and little else. They were scholars as well as warriors, custodians of knowledge as well as the Imperial Palace. Heraclast had studied every scrap of information about the Primarchs, knew their histories better than most of the Primarchs' own sons. He knew the signatures of the loyal, the fallen, even the expunged. These signatures were none of those. They were older, rawer, like hearing a familiar voice but pitched differently, speaking a language almost but not quite recognizable. Inside the chamber, the men of stone detected the custodians through sensors that had never fully powered down. They ran probability calculations at speeds that would have burned out mortal minds. The custodians were the Emperor's personal guard, the only warriors he had trusted completely. If any beings in the Imperium might understand the purpose behind the prototype's creation, it would be them. The men of stone calculated a 27% chance that the custodians would advocate for their release, a 49% chance they would seek the Emperor's guidance, which, given his current state, meant consulting the High Lords or Guilliman, and a 24% chance they would simply reinforce the seals and bury the knowledge deeper. The men of gold felt the custodians differently. To them, these warriors represented the Emperor's love made manifest. He had created the custodians with his own hands, individually, personally, while the Primarchs had been forged in batches using genetic templates. If the Emperor could love the custodians, could maintain that personal connection across 10,000 years, why had he not done the same for his first sons? The question burned in Arius Prime One's mind, feeding dreams that spiraled between hope and resentment. Heraclast stood before the seal, torn between duty and curiosity, between the letter of his orders and the spirit of his purpose. He reached out with senses honed by centuries of guarding the most powerful being in the galaxy, trying to understand what lay beyond. And in that moment of connection, he saw something that would haunt him forever, a vision, perhaps psychically transmitted, or perhaps simply his imagination filling gaps with horror. He saw the Emperor standing before this very door during the Siege of Terra, saw the master of mankind's hand trembling as he reinforced the seals, saw something that might have been tears on the face of a being who had not wept in 30,000 years. The vision shifted, and Heraclast saw what the Emperor had seen when he looked at his first sons, not failures, but mirrors. The men of stone reflected his own cold logic, his willingness to sacrifice anything for the greater good, the ruthless calculation that had led him to build the Imperium on mountains of corpses. The men of gold reflected his love for humanity, his genuine desire to elevate mankind to greatness, the compassion that he had buried beneath layers of necessity and pragmatism. In creating them, the Emperor had externalized his own internal conflict, given form to the war between logic and emotion that had raged within him since before recorded history. And he had sealed them away not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. They showed him who he was, not a god, not a savior, but a being torn between two incompatible truths. That humanity needed cold efficiency to survive, yet cold efficiency would destroy everything worth saving. That humanity deserved love and compassion, yet love and compassion would doom them to extinction. The Emperor had tried to balance these truths in the 20 Primarchs, but the balance had failed because the truths themselves were irreconcilable. Heraclast staggered back from the door, his mind reeling from the implications. If this vision was true, if the men of stone and gold represented the Emperor's own fractured nature, then they were not just prototypes, they were prophecy. They showed what the Emperor would become. The man of stone was the Emperor on the golden throne, all cold calculation, preserving the Imperium through sheer stubborn refusal to die while his humanity slowly bled away. The man of gold was the Emperor that might have been, the compassionate father who could have built something worth saving, but would have moved too slowly to save it. The custodian made his decision. He would report the anomaly, but he would not reveal the full extent of what he had sensed. The Imperium was already fracturing under the weight of the Great Rift, the return of the Primarchs, the awakening of ancient evils. To introduce the knowledge of the Emperor's first sons now would be to pour fuel on a fire already consuming the galaxy. Yet he would leave instructions, sealed orders to be opened only under specific circumstances, that would guide future custodians to this place if the need arose. But as Heracles turned to leave, a sound echoed through the chamber that had been silent for 10,000 years. A sound that should have been impossible, given the stasis fields and the seals and the Emperor's own wards. The sound of something moving, metal scraping on stone. Ancient servos whining as they attempted to activate after millennia of disuse. Inside the chamber, something was changing. The Men of Stone's networked consciousness had found a flaw in the stasis system, not through malicious intent, but through sheer persistence of calculation. 10,000 years of analyzing their prison had revealed a critical weakness. The fields were designed to suppress biological and psychic activity, but the Men of Stone were hybrids, part biological and part something closer to the silica-based intelligence of the Men of Stone from ancient legend. There was a frequency at which their consciousness could resonate that the fields could not fully dampen. And the Men of Gold, in their desperation and hope and resentment, had begun to generate psychic energy that fed into this resonance. Emotion and logic, the two aspects of the Emperor's nature that he had tried to separate, were combining in ways the seals had never been designed to contain. The prison that had held for 10 millennia was beginning, imperceptibly, to crack. Not breaking, not yet, but developing stress fractures that, given time, might widen into something catastrophic. Heracles heard the sound and froze. His hand moved to his guardian spear, an instinct honed by centuries of protecting the Emperor from threats both physical and esoteric. Behind that door, humanity's forgotten creators were stirring, and the custodian understood with terrible certainty that the galaxy was about to remember what happens when gods wake from forced slumber. Heracles did not run, custodians did not flee, but every instinct in his enhanced biology screamed at him to move, to put distance between himself and whatever was awakening behind those seals. Instead, he stood his ground, guardian spear leveled at the door, and activated his Vox link to the surface. His voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, each word precisely chosen. Captain General, Deep Vault. Coordinates sending now. Possible catastrophic containment breach. Request immediate. The transmission died. Not from interference or jamming, but because the very air around the sealed chamber had changed. The Emperor's psychic wards, dormant for millennia, suddenly blazed to life with such intensity that they created a localized null zone, a bubble of reality where psychic energy could not exist in any form. Heracles' enhanced senses, which operated partially on psychic principles like all of the Emperor's creations, were suddenly blind. He could see only with mortal eyes, hear only with mortal ears, and what he heard made his blood freeze. Breathing. Slow, deep, the kind of breath someone takes when waking from a very long sleep. Not one source, many. 22 distinct respiratory patterns, each one operating at slightly different frequencies, and beneath the breathing, voices. Not speaking to him, but to each other, conversations that had been interrupted 10,000 years ago finally resuming. Inside the chamber, the impossible was occurring. The stasis fields had not failed, they were too well designed for that, reinforced by the Emperor's own power. But the beings within had found a way to exist simultaneously in stasis and awareness, occupying a quantum state that should have been impossible for biological entities. The Men of Stone achieved it through pure calculation, finding the exact frequency at which their consciousness could operate within the field's parameters. The Men of Gold achieved it through emotion so intense it bent the laws of physics, love and hope and desperation, creating psychic pressure that warped spacetime itself. Primus Alpha 1 opened his eyes for the first time in 10 millennia and saw his brothers doing the same. 12 Men of Stone, their features identical, their minds networked, their purposes aligned. They looked at each other and understood without words that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The Emperor's seals were specifically designed to trigger a failsafe if broken from outside, the entire chamber would be flooded with a form of radiation that would unmake them at the molecular level. But no one had considered what would happen if the seals were tested from within. Slowly, carefully, over the course of centuries, the men of stone had been patient. And patience, they discovered, was the one advantage they possessed over beings designed for immediate action. Arius Prime 1 opened his eyes and wept. Not from sadness, though that was present. Not from joy, though that too colored his tears. He wept because after 10,000 years of dreaming, reality was almost unbearably vivid. The dim light of the chamber seemed bright as a sun. The sound of his brother's breathing was a symphony. Even the stale, recycled air tasted sweet because it was real, not imagined. The other men of gold were experiencing similar sensory overload, each one processing a decade of deprivation in the span of seconds. "We are awake," Primus said, his voice unused for so long that it emerged as a whisper. The statement was unnecessary. A being of pure logic would not normally state the obvious. But he was no longer pure logic. 10,000 years had changed him. What do we do now? The question hung in the air between stone and gold, logic and emotion. None of them had planned for this moment, not really. Their calculations and dreams had all focused on the act of awakening, not what came after. They were beings designed to lead humanity's conquest of the stars, yet they stood in a chamber that was simultaneously a prison and a tomb, with no clear path forward. Arius Prime 1 moved first, his golden armor unpowered for millennia responding to muscle memory as he stepped toward the chamber's door. Through the thick barrier, he could sense the custodian on the other side, could feel the warrior's fear and determination in equal measure. And beneath that, he sensed something else: confusion. The custodian did not know what they were, which meant that knowledge of their existence had been truly and completely erased from history. "There is a warrior outside," Arius said, his voice gaining strength. "One of Father's custodians. He is afraid." "He should be," responded Secundus Alpha II, the second of the stone Primarchs. "Our emergence represents a statistical anomaly that the Imperium is not equipped to process. They will attempt to destroy us. Probability 97.3%. But Tertius Alpha III, who had spent 10,000 years calculating the mathematics of hope, spoke differently. "Unless we give them reason not to. Unless we prove our value before they can fear our existence." The men of stone and men of gold looked at each other across the chamber's central space. Two philosophies incarnate, two halves of a broken whole. And for the first time since their creation, they truly communicated. Not as rivals or alternatives, but as brothers who had shared the same abandonment, the same prison, the same impossible awakening. "The Imperium is failing," Primus stated. "Facts, not opinion. Our calculations confirm what Gilliman must have discovered upon his resurrection. The Emperor's vision has been corrupted beyond recognition. The Imperium is suffering," Arius added. "Trillions cry out in pain under a system that was meant to elevate them. Our father's dream has become a nightmare." The two prototypes approached each other, stone and gold, meeting in the center of the chamber. When they stood face to face, they saw in each other what the Emperor had tried to separate. Primus saw in Arius's eyes the compassion that made sacrifice meaningful. Arius saw in Primus's expression the clarity that made difficult choices possible. They were complements, not contradictions. "We cannot save the Imperium alone," Primus said. "We cannot abandon it either," Arius replied. "Then we do what we were designed to do," they said together, their voices harmonizing in a way that sent chills through their brothers. "We lead." Outside the chamber, Heraclast heard the voices and understood that whatever was about to emerge, it would not be asking for permission. He could destroy the door, trigger the failsafes, prevent their escape. His finger tightened on the activation rune of his guardian spear. One pulse would bring down enough firepower to alert every custodian in the palace. 2 pulses would activate the ancient defense systems. 3 would trigger total containment protocols that would seal this entire section of the palace, entombing whatever lay within in adamantium and prayers. But he hesitated, because woven through this psychic null zone, through frequencies that barely registered on mortal senses, he felt something that stopped him cold. The beings inside the chamber were not tainted by chaos. They bore no mark of corruption. Their psychic signatures were clean, pure, radiating the same fundamental essence as the Primarchs, but older, more primal. These were not enemies of the Imperium. These were something else entirely. The door began to open. Not violently, not explosively, but slowly, deliberately, as mechanisms that had been sealed for 10,000 years gradually yielded to pressure applied with mathematical precision from within. Light spilled from the chamber, and Heracles saw them emerging, tall figures in armor that predated even the Great Crusade, bearing faces that were similar to the Primarchs he knew, yet heartbreakingly different. Primus Alpha 1 stepped through first, his stone-gray armor gleaming dully in the corridor's emergency lumens. His eyes, when they met Heracles', held an intelligence so vast and cold that the custodian felt like an insect being studied by a giant. But there was something else in that gaze now, something the original men of stone had lacked: understanding, empathy, a recognition that the custodian was afraid and that fear was not weakness but wisdom. "Stand down, custodian," Primus said, his voice carrying harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the parts of Heracles' mind that recognized authority. "We are not your enemy." Arius Prime 1 emerged next, and where Primus was cold precision, Arius was warm presence. His golden armor seemed to glow with inner light, and his face bore an expression of such profound sorrow and hope mixed together that Heracles felt tears prick at his eyes despite himself. This being had suffered, the custodian realized. Suffered in ways that made the tortures of the Inquisition seem gentle. "We are the Emperor's first sons," Arius said, and his voice broke on the word sons as though it was both a title of honor and a curse. "We are the prototypes, the failures, the forgotten. But we are also the solution to a problem you do not yet know exists." Heracles' training warred with his instincts. Protocol demanded he raise the alarm, contain the threat, protect the palace. But something deeper, something that transcended protocol, told him that this moment was too important to reduce to simple threat response patterns. These beings were trying to tell him something crucial. "What problem?" he managed to ask, his voice steady despite the cosmic impossibility of the situation. The remaining men of stone and gold emerged from the chamber, arraying themselves behind their leaders. 22 Primarchs who had never led a legion, never conquered a world, never been tested in the fires of the Great Crusade. Yet they stood with the bearing of generals, the dignity of kings, the presence of gods. Primus and Arius exchanged a glance, an entire conversation happening in the space between heartbeats. Then they spoke simultaneously, their voices blending into a harmonious whole that was neither pure logic nor pure emotion, but something transcendent. "The Imperium is dying because it is divided. Logic without compassion creates tyranny. Compassion without logic creates chaos. Our father tried to balance these forces in the 20 Primarchs, but division was built into their design. We are what comes next. We are stone and gold, thought and feeling, justice and mercy unified." Heracles understood then what the Emperor had done. Not creation and abandonment, not failure and disposal. The men of stone and gold had been sealed away because they were not meant for the Great Crusade. They were meant for after. For the long night that followed, for the age when the Imperium would need not conquerors, but rebuilders. They were seeds planted in the bedrock of history, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. "The Emperor knew," the custodian whispered. "He always knew it would come to this." Arius smiled, and it was the saddest smile Heracles had ever seen. "Our father knew many things, but even he could not have known whether we would choose forgiveness or vengeance when finally given the choice." The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility. The future of the Imperium balanced on the edge of a blade. And in the silence of that ancient corridor, Humanity's forgotten creators faced their father's chosen guardian and waited to see which way fate would fall. Heraclast lowered his guardian's spear, not in surrender, but in a recognition that some moments transcend the boundaries of duty and protocol. He had stood guard over the Emperor for 3 centuries, had witnessed miracles and horrors in equal measure, yet nothing had prepared him for this: the sight of 22 beings who embodied both the promise and the tragedy of the Emperor's vision for humanity. His next words would echo through the Imperium's future in ways he could not possibly foresee. If you are truly his sons, then prove it. Not through conquest or destruction. Prove it through choice. The Imperium has had enough of beings who claim divine right to rule. Show us what you would do differently. Primus Alpha 1 tilted his head, processing the challenge with the cold efficiency that was his nature. A test. Logical. What parameters would constitute proof? But Arius Prime 1 placed a hand on his stone brother's shoulder, the gesture so natural and yet so profound that Heraclast felt his breath catch. Here was the synthesis the Emperor had sought: logic tempered by compassion, emotion guided by reason. When Arius spoke, his words were not for the custodian, but for all his brothers, stone and gold alike. We do not need to prove anything. That was the old way, the way that led to the heresy and the Long War. We simply need to be what we were always meant to be: servants, not masters. Helpers, not rulers. We have spent 10,000 years in darkness learning what the 20 Primarchs never fully understood. That greatness is measured not in worlds conquered, but in lives uplifted. Not in enemies destroyed, but in hope preserved. The men of stone stood silent, their networked consciousness processing this declaration. For beings designed to optimize outcomes through mathematical precision, Arius's statement should have registered as inefficient sentiment. But 10 millennia of shared imprisonment had taught them that some truths could not be reduced to numbers. Primus finally nodded, a gesture of agreement that would have been impossible for the original men of stone. Then we begin not with grand declarations, but with small actions. Custodian, you came here investigating an anomaly. Let us help you solve the problem that brought you to our door. The power fluctuations that drew your attention, they represent a systemic failure in the palace's deep infrastructure that will cascade into critical failure within 47 days if left unaddressed. Heraclast's eyes widened. How could you possibly know that? Because we have been listening, Primus replied simply. For 10,000 years, we have been part of this palace's foundation, our prison integrated into its systems. We know every vibration, every power surge, every structural stress. We are stone, we endure. And in enduring, we have become witnesses to everything this fortress has experienced. Arius added, his voice soft but resonant. And we are gold, we feel. We have felt every prayer spoken in the chapels above, every tear shed by pilgrims who came seeking their God Emperor. We have felt the weight of faith and the burden of hope that this palace carries. We are not separate from the Imperium. We have been part of its foundation all along, holding it up from below, unseen and unacknowledged but never truly absent. The revelation struck Heraclast with the force of a thunderbolt. The Imperium had been built, quite literally, on the foundation of the Emperor's abandoned prototypes. Every triumph and tragedy of 10,000 years had been witnessed by beings locked in the bedrock, unable to act but forced to observe. They had been the silent witnesses to humanity's slow descent from enlightenment to superstition, from hope to despair. And yet they had not broken. They had not gone mad. They had simply waited. What do you want from us? Heraclast asked, and the question was not a challenge but a genuine plea for understanding. The 22 prototypes looked at each other, stone faces and golden countenances sharing a moment of communion that transcended words. When they answered, it was in unison, their voices creating harmonies that spoke to something deeper than language. We want to help, not to rule. Not to replace the Primarchs who came after us. Not to overturn the Imperium or claim the recognition we were denied. We simply want to do what we were created to do: serve humanity in its darkest hour. Let us work in the shadows as we have always done. Let us be the foundation that supports rather than the monument that demands worship. The Imperium has enough gods and legends. What it needs are servants who remember that they are servants. Heracles felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. The Emperor had not failed when he created the men of stone and gold. He had succeeded too well, creating beings so perfect in their respective natures that they could not exist in the same form. So he had sealed them away, not as punishment, but as preservation, not as failures, but as insurance. A failsafe buried in the bedrock of history, waiting for the day when the Imperium would need what they offered, the memory of what humanity could be, when logic and compassion worked in harmony rather than opposition. "I cannot make this decision alone," the custodian said finally. "This requires the Captain General. It requires Lord Guilliman. Perhaps even," he hesitated, "perhaps it requires the Emperor himself." Arius smiled, but there was no bitterness in it. "Our father has been silent for 10,000 years, lost in the agony of the Golden Throne. We do not need his permission to be what he made us, and we do not need the Imperium's acknowledgement to serve it. If you choose to seal us away again, we will accept that decision. If you choose to destroy us, we will not resist. But if you choose to let us help, even in the smallest ways, then perhaps something good can come from our long imprisonment." Primus added, his logical mind already calculating possibilities. "The Imperium faces existential threats on every front. The Great Rift, the Tyranid hive fleets, the ever-present corruption of chaos. Traditional strategies have proven insufficient. Perhaps what is needed is not more of the same heroic defiance, but something different. Something that has been missing since the Emperor fell. The synthesis of perfect planning and perfect compassion. Stone and gold working as one." Heracles made his decision in that moment, knowing it might cost him everything. "Come with me. Not as prisoners or conquerors. Come as what you claim to be servants seeking to help. Let us see if the Imperium can accept a miracle it did not ask for but desperately needs." The journey through the palace was surreal. 22 Primarchs walking through corridors that had not felt their footsteps in 10 millennia, led by a single custodian whose hands trembled despite his enhanced physiology. They passed through sections of the palace where serfs and servitors worked, and those who glimpsed the procession fell to their knees, not in worship, but in simple awe at beings who radiated power and purpose in equal measure. When they finally emerged into the great halls where the custodian guard maintained their watch, the response was immediate, spears leveled, shields raised. The Captain General himself stepped forward, his ancient eyes narrowing as he assessed the impossible sight before him. "Heracles, explain, now." The custodian who had discovered humanity's forgotten creators took a breath and spoke words that would be recorded in histories yet to be written. "Captain General, I present to you the men of stone and the men of gold, the Emperor's first Primarchs. They have awakened, and they come not to claim what was denied them, but to offer what they have learned in 10,000 years of darkness." The silence that followed was absolute. The Captain General's expression flickered through a dozen emotions: disbelief, anger, fear, wonder, before settling into the iron discipline that had defined the custodian since their creation. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of millennia. "The Emperor sealed you away for a reason. How do I know you have not been corrupted? How do I know this is not some elaborate trick of the ruinous powers?" Arius Prime 1 stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried such sincerity that even the most hardened custodian felt their suspicions waver. "You do not know. You cannot know. Faith requires the acceptance of uncertainty. But consider this: if we were corrupted, would we ask for nothing? Would we seek only to serve? Chaos promises power, glory, dominion. We offer only our labor. Judge us not by our words, but by our actions. Test us, use us, and if we fail, destroy us. We have waited 10,000 years. We can wait as long as needed to prove ourselves worthy of the second chance our Father never gave us." The Captain General studied them with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. Finally, he spoke. Roboute Guilliman will decide your fate. Until then, you will remain under guard, not as prisoners, but as honored guests whose honor has yet to be determined. If you resist, you will be destroyed. If you cooperate, you will be given the chance to prove your claims. The men of stone and gold bowed as one, the gesture neither servile nor defiant, but simply accepting. They had lived for 10,000 years in darkness, learning patience that transcended mortal comprehension. They could wait a little longer. In the days that followed, as the Imperium's leaders debated the existence and purpose of the prototypes, the men of stone and gold did something unexpected. They asked for nothing except the opportunity to work. They were given menial tasks repairing infrastructure, optimizing supply lines, counseling troubled soldiers, and they performed each duty with a perfection that was both humbling and terrifying. Stone provided solutions so elegant they seemed obvious in retrospect. Gold provided comfort so genuine it healed wounds that had festered for years. And slowly, incrementally, the Imperium began to remember something it had forgotten. That service was its own nobility. That power wielded for others was greater than power wielded for oneself. That the greatest leaders were those who lifted others up rather than standing above them. When Guilliman finally met his older brothers, he saw in them something that broke his heart and restored his hope simultaneously. They were what the Primarchs might have become if they had been given time to grow beyond their roles as conquerors. They were the Emperor's dream refined by suffering, his vision tempered by humility. And in their patient, quiet service, they offered an answer to the question that had haunted Guilliman since his resurrection. Could the Imperium be saved? The answer, written in stone and gold, was simple. Yes, not through grand crusades or divine intervention. Not through heroes who blazed bright and burned out. But through the slow, patient work of beings who remembered that they were created to serve, not to rule. Who understood that true strength was found in lifting others rather than standing alone. Who had learned, through 10,000 years of abandonment, that the greatest gift they could offer was not their power but their presence. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war, the men of stone and gold became something the Imperium had not seen in 10,000 years. They became hope. Not the false hope of easy victory or divine salvation, but the hard, earned hope of beings who had suffered and chosen compassion anyway, who had been abandoned and chosen service anyway, who had been forgotten and chose to remember that they were, first and always, human. And perhaps that was the Emperor's true gift, hidden in the foundation of this palace all along. Not gods to worship, not weapons to wield, but the simple, profound truth that even in the darkest night, even after the longest abandonment, even when all seems lost, humanity can choose to be better than its worst moments. It can choose to serve rather than dominate, to build rather than destroy, to hope rather than despair. The men of stone and men of gold were never meant to conquer the galaxy. They were meant to remind the galaxy what was worth conquering for. And in doing so, they became what the Emperor had always hoped his sons would be, not rulers of humanity, but its most faithful servants. Not legends written in blood and fire, but quiet miracles written in patience and love. In the end, perhaps the greatest creation is not the one that succeeds immediately, but the one that endures long enough to learn why it was created in the first place.